Have you ever stood in a room filled with every luxury imaginable, only to realize that the most expensive thing in the house was the silence? For Julian, a 48-year-old real estate visionary who had reshaped the skyline of Seattle, that silence had become a suffocating shroud. He was a man who spoke in contracts and blueprints, a man whose time was measured in millions, yet he was a ghost in his own kingdom. His mansion, a marvel of glass and steel overlooking the grey expanse of the Puget Sound, was a masterpiece of cold perfection. Every evening he returned to a home where the only greeting was the hum of the climate control and the faint rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock that felt like a countdown to an empty forever. He had built an empire that was the envy of the Pacific Northwest. But as he stood on his balcony watching the rain streak the glass like tears on a forgotten face, he knew he was bankrupt in the only currency that truly mattered. He had everything he had ever chased, and yet he had nothing at all to hold on to when the lights went out. The walls of his study were lined with awards and photographs of him shaking hands with mayors and governors. But there wasn't a single frame containing a smile that was meant only for him. Julian had spent his youth convinced that emotional walls were the only way to protect a legacy. That vulnerability was a crack in the foundation of a great man. But at 48, he was beginning to realize that a foundation without a heart is just a tomb. He ate alone, he thought alone, and he dreamed of things he couldn't name because he had forgotten the language of desire. The social gatherings he attended were merely chess matches where he wore a mask of polite indifference, calculating moves and counter-moves while his soul drifted further out to sea. His employees treated him with a reverence that was indistinguishable from fear, keeping a distance he had mandated years ago. Among them was Elena, a 32-year-old woman who had managed his gardens and estate interiors for 4 years. She was efficient, quiet, and moved through the house with a grace that made her almost invisible, a shadow that kept his world blooming while he remained frozen in winter. One Tuesday evening, the air thick with the scent of an approaching storm, Julian was walking toward his library when a sound shattered the polished stillness of the hallway. It was a voice, but not the measured, professional tone he was used to. It was a sound of raw, unadulterated desperation. He stopped in the shadows of the corridor, his expensive leather shoes sinking into the plush carpet, making no sound. The voice was coming from the kitchen, muffled and trembling, thick with the kind of sorrow that makes the throat ache just by listening. It was Elena. She was on the phone, her words coming in ragged gasps, as if she were drowning in plain sight. Julian stood frozen, not out of a desire to spy, but out of a sudden, jarring realization that he was witnessing a human being in a state of total collapse. In 4 years, he had never seen her as anything more than a component of his lifestyle, a person who ensured his coffee was hot and his hedges were straight. But this voice, vulnerable, real, and shattered, reminded him that beneath the uniform was a heart that was currently breaking into 1,000 jagged pieces. "I need someone, Maya. I need a partner for tomorrow," Elena whispered, her voice cracking under a weight Julian couldn't fathom. "I can't go back there alone, not this time." There was a long pause, filled only with the sound of her trying to catch her breath, a jagged, lonely sound that echoed through the high-ceilinged kitchen. Julian leaned against the cold marble wall, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way that felt foreign. A partner for tomorrow. The phrase sounded like something from a desperate novel, a plea for a miracle in a world that had run out of them. But there was no humor in her tone, only a terrifying urgency. As he listened, the layers of her dilemma began to unfold like a map of a territory he had never visited. Elena wasn't talking about a social obligation or a vanity project. She was talking about a final stand against a reality that was closing in on her. Julian felt a strange prickly sensation behind his eyes, a flicker of empathy that he had suppressed for so long he barely recognized it. He realized then that he knew nothing about the woman who had spent more time in his house over the last 4 years than anyone else. Elena continued to speak, her words spilling out in a frantic confession to her friend. She spoke of her mother, Grace, who was living her final months in a small coastal town 3 hours away. She spoke of a family reunion centered around her younger sister's engagement, a celebration that was meant to be the last time the whole family would be together under one roof. But the invitation came with a hidden price, a cultural and familial expectation that weighed more than lead. Her family, rooted in old-world traditions, viewed Elena's independence as a tragedy, a sign that she was adrift and unprotected in a world they didn't trust. For years she had been the subject of whispered pity and pointed questions, but now, with her mother's health failing, the pressure had become unbearable. Her mother's greatest wish, the one thing she asked for with her weakening breath, was to see Elena happy, settled, and cherished by someone who would look after her when Grace was gone. It was a lie of necessity, a fiction required to give a dying woman a moment of peace. The irony was a jagged blade. Eleanor had sacrificed her own youth and personal life to work in the city, sending every spare cent back home to cover her father's medical bills and now her mother's palliative care. She had renounced her own chances at love to ensure her family survived, and now that same family was inadvertently punishing her for the very solitude her sacrifice had created. She had tried to find anyone to play the part for a single day, but her circle was small and the request was too strange, too heavy. They all said no, Maya. They said it was too much of a lie. She sobbed into the phone. Julian felt a surge of unexpected anger toward these unknown people who could turn their backs on such a humble, heartbreaking request. He looked at his hands, the hands of a man who moved mountains of capital, and felt a sudden profound sense of uselessness. He was surrounded by power, but he had never used it to mend a heart. The guilt began to climb his throat, a bitter vine of realization that he had walked past this woman's quiet suffering every single day without a second glance. Before we continue this journey of unexpected connections, take a moment to consider the invisible lives around you. If you find value in these stories of the human heart, consider joining our community by subscribing. We explore the depths of empathy and the quiet miracles that happen when we finally choose to see one another. Your presence here helps us keep these stories alive, reminding us all that no one is truly an island. Now let us return to that darkened hallway where a decision was about to be made. Julian remained in the shadows for a long time after Eleanor hung up the phone. He heard her footsteps as she moved across the kitchen, the sound of water running as she washed the evidence of tears from her face, preparing to put on her professional mask once more. He knew he should leave, that he should retreat to his study and pretend he had heard nothing. That was the safe move, the logical move, the move of a man who valued his boundaries above all else. But as he looked at the cold, expensive marble of his hallway, he realized that he couldn't go back to the way things were. He couldn't unhear the sound of a soul crying out for help. He took a deep breath, smoothing his perfectly tailored suit, and for the first time in a decade, he decided to do something that wasn't on the agenda. He stepped into the light, his heart racing with a nervous energy that made him feel more alive than he had in years. When Eleanor stepped out of the kitchen, she nearly collided with him. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her face pale, and for a moment terror flashed across her features. She looked like a deer caught in the glare of a hunter, someone who had been caught in a moment of unforgivable weakness. "Mr. Thorne, I'm so sorry, I didn't know you were still down here," she stammered, her hands trembling as she smoothed her apron. She was already building the walls back up, apologizing for her humanity, trying to shrink back into the invisible employee he had trained her to be. But Julian didn't let her. He held up a hand, a gesture that was surprisingly gentle, stopping the torrent of apologies before they could drown the truth. He looked at her not as a boss looking at a subordinate, but as a man looking at a woman, acknowledging the depth of the pain he had just witnessed. "You don't have to apologize, Elena," he said, his voice lower and softer than she had ever heard it. "I was the one who was listening, albeit unintentionally." Elena's face drained of what little color was left, her breath catching in her throat as she realized exactly how much he had heard. The silence between them was heavy, pregnant with the weight of her exposed secret. Julian saw her shoulders slump, the dignity she had fought so hard to maintain finally giving way under the crushing embarrassment of the moment. He saw the cracks in her skin from years of hard work, the exhaustion etched into the corners of her mouth, and the sheer bravery in her eyes as she prepared for a reprimand or worse, his pity. But Julian didn't offer pity. He offered something much more dangerous and much more beautiful. He offered himself. "I overheard your dilemma," he continued, leaning against the doorframe to appear less intimidating. "And I realize that I have no plans for tomorrow. My schedule is entirely empty, save for things that can easily be rescheduled." Elena blinked, her confusion momentarily overriding her embarrassment. Julian took a step toward her, his expression a mix of solemnity and a vulnerability that mirrored her own. "If you still need someone to go with you to your sister's engagement, if you still need that partner for a day, I would like to be that person." The words hung in the air like a bridge over an abyss. Elena stared at him, her mouth opening and closing as her brain struggled to process the absurdity of the proposal. This man, a tycoon whose face appeared in business journals, was offering to play the part of a boyfriend for a gardener in a small coastal town. It was madness, a glitch in the reality they both inhabited. I don't understand," Elena whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why would you do that, Mr. Thorne? You don't even know me. This isn't part of my job, and it is certainly not part of yours." She took a step back, her suspicion flaring. She lived in a world where nothing was free, where people like Julian didn't move without a motive. But Julian only smiled, a sad, honest smile that reached his eyes for the first time in years. He explained that he wasn't doing it as a transaction or an act of charity. He admitted, with a bluntness that shocked her, that he was tired of his own company, tired of the hollow success that greeted him every night. He told her that he had spent years pretending to be happy in rooms full of powerful people, and he figured he might as well spend one day pretending to be happy for someone who actually deserved it. The drive to the coast the next morning was unlike any journey Julian had ever taken. He had traded his luxury sedan for a more understated SUV, and he wore a simple, high-quality sweater and dark jeans, looking more like a man on vacation than a CEO on a mission. Elena sat beside him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her anxiety a tangible force in the car. They had spent the first hour establishing a backstory. They had met at a botanical gala. He was a developer with a passion for sustainable landscapes, and they had been seeing each other for 7 months. Simple, believable, and enough to satisfy a mother's curiosity. But as the city skyline faded into the rear-view mirror and the lush, towering evergreens of the Olympic Peninsula began to surround them, the conversation shifted from the script to the reality of their lives. For the first time, Julian asked questions. He asked about her childhood, her dreams of one day owning her own nursery, and the specific way the light hit the coast in her hometown. He listened as she talked about her father's love for the sea and her mother's stubborn, beautiful optimism even in the face of illness. In turn, Julian found himself talking about his own childhood, a subject he usually avoided. He spoke of his father's relentless drive and the coldness of a home where love was conditional on achievement. He realized with a start that he was telling Elena things he had never told his closest business associates. There was something about the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers and the isolation of the car that made honesty feel like the only option. By the time they reached the outskirts of the small town, the air between them had shifted. The professional distance was gone, replaced by a tentative, fragile intimacy born of shared secrets. The family home was a weathered, salt-sprayed cottage surrounded by a riot of wild roses and hydrangeas. It was the complete opposite of Julian's mansion. It was small, cluttered, and vibrantly alive. As they stepped out of the car, Julian felt a wave of apprehension he hadn't felt since his first multi-million-dollar closing. He took Elena's hand, a gesture meant for the performance, but as her fingers interlaced with his, a jolt of genuine warmth raced up his arm. Her hand was small and calloused, a testament to her hard work, and holding it felt like holding onto a piece of the earth itself. The front door burst open, and a swarm of people spilled out. Aunts, cousins, and a younger sister who looked like a brighter, less burdened version of Elena. The air was filled with the smell of roasting meat and wood smoke, and the sound of laughter that was loud, unself-conscious, and deeply welcoming. Then he saw her. Elena's mother, Grace, was sitting in a wheelchair on the porch, a thick wool blanket over her knees despite the mild weather. She was thin, her skin like parchment, but her eyes were sharp and filled with a fierce maternal love. When she saw Elena, her face transformed, a radiance breaking through the fatigue of her illness. Julian watched as Elena ran to her mother, the two women embracing with a desperation that brought a lump to his throat. He stood back, a silent witness to a bond he had never experienced, feeling like a traveler who had finally stumbled upon a hearth after a lifetime in the cold. When Elena finally pulled away and introduced him, Julian felt Grace's gaze sweep over him, measuring his soul with the uncanny intuition of the dying. "So this is the man who has stolen my daughter's heart," Grace said, her voice raspy but firm. She took Julian's hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Thank you for coming, Julian. It means the world to her, and more to me." Julian didn't know how to respond to such naked sincerity. He found himself bowing his head, a gesture of respect that was entirely unscripted. He spent the afternoon immersed in a world he had only ever seen from a distance. He helped set up tables. He listened to stories about Elena's childhood mischief, and he ate food that was simple but prepared with a soul-deep affection. No one cared about his net worth or his business ventures. They cared that he was the man who made Elena smile, the man who brought her home. Throughout the celebration, Julian kept his eyes on Elena. He saw her in her element, laughing with her sister, tending to her mother's comfort, and moving through the crowd with a lightness he had never seen in Seattle. She was a revelation. He realized that the woman who cleaned his house was only a fraction of the person she truly was. She was the heart of this family, the pillar upon which they all leaned, and her strength was more impressive than any skyscraper he had ever built. He felt a profound sense of shame for having looked at her for 4 years without truly seeing her. He had been a king in a tower, oblivious to the royalty living right under his roof. As the sun began to set, casting a golden-orange glow over the Pacific, the family gathered in the small backyard for a traditional dance. A local musician played an acoustic guitar, the melody sweet and melancholic. Julian took Elena's hand and led her to the makeshift dance floor, a patch of grass near the rose bushes. As they moved together, the rest of the world seemed to fall away. The noise of the party, the salt in the air, the eyes of the family, it all became a blurred background to the sudden, overwhelming reality of her in his arms. They weren't acting anymore. The way her head rested against his shoulder, the way his arms circled her waist to draw her closer, the way their breathing fell into a synchronized rhythm. It was all real. In the middle of the dance, Elena looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "You're doing a wonderful job," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "My mother hasn't looked this happy in months. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Julian looked down at her, his heart aching with a truth he was only beginning to understand. "You don't owe me anything, Elena," he said softly. "This day has given me more than I could ever give you." The music slowed, and for a moment they were frozen in a pocket of time. Moved by an impulse he didn't try to fight, Julian leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. It was supposed to be the final flourish of their performance, the ultimate proof for the watching family. But the moment their lips touched, the lie vanished. The kiss was soft, lingering, and tasted of salt and hidden hope. It was a bridge crossing the final distance between them, a silent confession that the fake relationship had become the most real thing in either of their lives. When they finally pulled apart, the look in Eleanor's eyes was one of pure, unadulterated shock, mirrored by the thundering of Julian's own heart. The family cheered and clapped, delighted by the display of affection. But Julian and Eleanor were silent, caught in the gravity of what had just happened. They finished the dance in a daze, the air between them now electric with a new, terrifying potential. As the party wound down and they prepared to leave, Grace called Julian to her side one last time. She leaned in close, her eyes searching his. "Take care of her, Julian," she whispered. "She has spent her whole life taking care of us. She deserves someone who will finally take care of her." Julian nodded, his throat too tight for words, knowing that the promise he was making was no longer part of a script. The drive back to Seattle was shrouded in a heavy contemplative silence. The rain had returned, drumming a steady rhythm on the roof of the SUV, matching the intensity of the thoughts racing through Julian's mind. He looked at Elena, who was staring out the window at the passing shadows of the trees. He wanted to say something, to address the kiss, to explain that he was different now, but the words felt clumsy and inadequate. He was terrified of breaking the spell, of returning to the cold reality of the city and finding that the magic of the coast didn't travel. Elena seemed to feel the same, her posture rigid, her thoughts a mystery he couldn't yet solve. When they reached the mansion, the glass and steel looked even colder than before. The luxury felt hollow, a monument to a man who had finally realized he was living in a cage. Julian walked Elena to her quarters in the back of the house, the silence between them now vibrating with the tension of things unsaid. They stood at her door, the dim hallway light casting long shadows between them. "I'll be in late tomorrow," Elena said, her voice formal once again, a desperate attempt to return to the safety of their roles. "I have some things to organize before I continue my duties." Julian nodded, feeling a sharp pang of loss. He watched her go inside, and as the door clicked shut, he felt the silence of his mansion descend on him like a physical weight. The next few days were a study in agony. Elena was there, but she wasn't. She moved through the rooms with a ghost-like efficiency, avoiding his gaze, leaving rooms the moment he entered. The warmth they had shared was gone, replaced by a professional frost that was more painful than her previous invisibility. Julian tried to focus on his work, but the numbers on his screen felt like a foreign language. He found himself sitting in his study, staring at the empty space where she used to stand, remembering the taste of her kiss and the weight of her hand in his. He realized that he couldn't go back. He couldn't live in a world where she was just an employee, a person who facilitated his life without being a part of it. A week after the wedding, Julian came down to the dining room and found a letter on the table. It was brief, written in Elena's neat, careful hand. She was resigning. She explained that she couldn't stay, that the boundaries had become too blurred, and that she needed space to figure out what was real. She thanked him for his kindness, for the gift he had given her mother, and she asked him not to look for her. Julian felt the world tilt beneath his feet. The fear he had felt in the car, the fear that it was all temporary, had come true. He sat at the table, the expensive breakfast she had prepared for him growing cold, and for the first time in 20 years, the great Julian Thorne felt like he was about to break. But Julian hadn't built an empire by giving up when things got difficult. He realized that if he let her go now, he would be resigning himself to a lifetime of silence. He didn't want a gardener. He didn't want a housekeeper. He wanted the woman who had shown him what it meant to be alive. He spent the day searching for her, not as a boss looking for an employee, but as a man looking for his future. He found her in a small park they had passed on their way back from the coast, a place she had mentioned she liked to visit when she needed to think. She was sitting on a bench, her coat pulled tight against the Seattle drizzle, looking small and lost in the grey landscape. He approached her slowly, his heart in his throat. When she saw him, she stood up, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. "I told you not to come," she whispered, but she didn't move away. Julian stopped a few feet from her, letting the rain fall on his face, stripping away the last of his executive polish. "I couldn't help it," he said, his voice raw with honesty. "I realize that I don't care about the house, Elena. I don't care about the rules or the roles. I only care about the fact that when I'm with you, the silence finally stops." He told her that he didn't want her to work for him ever again. He wanted to take her to dinner, to learn everything about her that he had missed, and to earn the right to be the man her mother thought he was. He admitted that he was scared, that he was out of practice with being human, but that he was willing to learn if she would teach him. Eleanor looked at him for a long time, the rain mingling with the tears on her cheeks. And then she smiled, the real smile, the one that had lit up the coastal cottage. She took a step toward him, and as she reached out to take his hand, Julian knew that the silence was finally over. 2 years later, in a small garden overlooking the Sound, surrounded by the family that had become his own, Julian and Eleanor were married. Grace was there, frail but beaming, having lived to see her greatest wish fulfilled. As they stood under a canopy of roses, exchanging vows that were no longer part of a performance, Julian realized that the most important thing he had ever built wasn't made of steel or glass. It was made of the quiet courage it takes to see another person, and the even greater courage it takes to let yourself be seen. If this story reminded you of the beauty hidden in the people we often overlook, please share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had a moment where a stranger or an acquaintance suddenly became someone essential to your life? We would love to hear your stories of connection and empathy. Don't forget to subscribe and become part of our community of heart-centered storytellers. Let's continue to remind each other that the most extraordinary stories often begin in the most ordinary places. May you find someone who silences the emptiness in your life and fills it with a light you never expected. Until our next journey together, take care of your heart and the hearts of those around you.